Thank you so much for spending your Sunday afternoon with us on the beautiful beaches of Calicut. It's, I have to say, it's a little bit terrifying for me to talk to you in Kerala because you are, like, I think everyone here treats you as one of their own.
I am one of their own. What do you mean? Oh, 1 second. ഇതാ എൻ്റെ 10 മിനിറ്റ് പോയി അതുകൊണ്ട് ഞാൻ 10 മിനിറ്റ് കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് ഇറങ്ങത്തുള്ളൂ സ്റ്റേജിൽ നിന്ന് 45 minutes is not fair. അതിനെ 55 ആക്കൂ.
That's what we did in the previous session, by the way. So we're all sorted. Okay, so I'm really delighted to be in conversation with Manu about God's guns and missionaries. And to begin with, I want to take this conversation home to Kerala. Kerala has an extraordinarily diverse population. I think it is at 6.1 million Christians. It is the largest in sheer numbers, the largest Christian population in India, and also just truly a very, very diverse population. Just in the last 3 days that I've been in Calicut, I have heard church bells, I've heard temple bells, I've heard the azan, and it's, I mean, this is the India that we know and love, right? So in an environment like this, I wonder if there is a way for you to begin this conversation by bringing it home to Kerala and telling us what was the Christian encounter like in this state.
You know, a few years ago on Twitter, I remember seeing a right-wing influencer who would come to Kerala on some holiday and use the words, oh, I came to Kerala and it's infested with churches. And I was like, what does that even mean? But it also signifies a lack of historical awareness because the understanding they had was that, oh, this is some kind of colonial conversion project that led to so many churches in Kerala, which is highly unhistorical because the frank truth is we've had Malayali Christians in this land for much longer than parts of Europe. People have been Christian here for at least 1,500 or so years, if not more. The tradition is even more, like 2,000 years. So this was very much a place where Christianity as a religion was welcome. It was at home. You have cases in the 18th century, etc., where it's local rajas who are confirming the spiritual heads of the various Christian churches because it was very much part of the raja's domain also, and the Christians also acknowledged the local Hindu raja's authority. The customs, they were purely Malayali in nature. So that's why when the first Europeans came and they said, well, you must now bow down to the Pope, a number of Christians, the Nasrani Christians here who've been here for ages, they were like, no, we've never heard of the Pope. So it's a bit awkward now to bring in a figure like that. Catholicism wasn't their Christianity. They had their leaders coming out of Persia in those days. Similarly, the liturgy that was used, the texts that were used. The Portuguese at one point went on a whole burning expedition because they were burning the Nasrani's religious texts because they saw them as heretical, even though they were very much part of the local Christian tradition. And on the ground, you know, it's fascinating how there aren't too many differences in some respects between the Hindus and the Christians in their practices. You have scholars like Susan Bailey who've written about how in appearance, just as the Nair man would have a kudumi and a certain way of dressing, the Syrian Christian would also dress a certain way. Just as the Nair was considered an upper caste member of society, the Syrian Christian was considered an upper caste member of society. I remember my great-grandfather was a school headmaster, and they say that every year he used to do an Onam Sadhya at home. And this was still a time of caste. So although all the teachers were welcome, the seating was on the basis of caste. So it's embarrassing to say, but the Pillai Samudayam teachers of the Dalit communities, they were served their food at the cowshed. Latin Catholics and later converts to Christianity were also made to sit at the cowshed. But the Syrian Christian was permitted access to the main veranda of the house where, you know, all the upper castes would be served, although not in the same area or the same row as the Hindus. So it's interesting that the Syrian Christian was seen very much as an upper caste element in Kerala society. You have cases where in churches there were cock sacrifices, you know, there were rituals that were very much of the same type that you follow in Hindu temples. And the early missionaries and the early Portuguese who came here, so we should qualify this as white men who came here, they were a bit astonished to see this and a bit thrown to see this. And just as they did in Goa, where they not only encouraged people to convert, but also encouraged them to Europeanize themselves, give up local names, give up local habits, give up local customs, local music, local traditions, and to become almost westernized in their outlook. In Kerala, they made an attempt, but it didn't quite work precisely because Christianity as a culture and religion was so rooted here already, it wasn't that easy for the Portuguese to shake it up. Ultimately, there were people who did subscribe to Catholicism, but it was never of the type that the Portuguese would have preferred. It was not an entirely westernized type.
Understood. We've kind of jumped to the caste angle pretty early in the conversation, so let's stick a pin in that and come back to, let's just open up this conversation by talking about the title. Gods, Guns, and Missionaries. Can you tell us what these three things specifically mean to you?
So Mansi and I have been in conversation in 3 places now. So this is a question that we've decided we'll always bring up at the start of the conversation. Partly because this is a way to contextualize what this book is about. And as I've said in multiple interviews, etc., the idea of the title was to give an impression of the core thematic interests of the book. So the word gods is a reference to divinity, of course, but also human beings arguing over divinity. Because in the book, one of the clashes you see is between a polytheistic culture and a monotheistic idea of God. There is one God, according to one set of people, but the Hindus here are worshipping a polytheistic range of gods, an entire battalion of gods. The counter to that from the Hindus was that no, we also believe in one God, except that that God takes multiple forms. So it is monotheism, but with a polytheistic sort of infrastructure attached to it. So that's the gods reference in the title, people fighting over the idea of God and what is the right idea of God. The next one is guns, which is both a reference to the guns of the East India Company and the Portuguese and the colonizer who came to India, but also a reference in many ways to the way Indians ultimately respond. By the late 19th century, early 20th century, we have revolutionary guns moving around. A figure like Savarkar, who appears at the end of the book, one of the reasons he was arrested was because he was smuggling guns into India around 1910, 1911. So the guns is a reference to colonialism and some of the dynamics that spawned. And the missionaries are, of course, the tantalizing, fascinating entity, at least for me personally, because it's not as if you meet one kind of monolithic missionary. The missionary itself has multiple forms. There are different types of missionaries. There's, say, one kind of missionary who comes in with a degree of contempt, doesn't understand local culture, has no desire to understand local culture, and judges everything he sees. And these are all men at that time. But there's also the kind of missionary who comes in with curiosity. Of course, there is the idea of conversion, but they are also willing to learn. They're interested in these cultures. They want to understand what the people here are reading, what their ideas of philosophy are. So there's a degree of curiosity, and there's a degree, a desire to sort of make sense of the local culture on its own terms. And of course, the missionaries have different strategies to even enable conversion. So that's the third element of the book. So it's really a composite of colonialism, ideas of religion, and the whole pressure of the missionary, and how that ends up reshaping and reformulating what we today call Hinduism and the modern Hindu identity.
So this thing about monotheism versus polytheism, and then the Hinduism's response, which is that actually ours is also monotheistic, it's just that our gods take multiple forms. This is kind of like a recurring phenomenon in the Hindu response to the Christian encounter, which is they adapt whatever argument is thrown at them to use it for their own purposes. So like Hinduism feels like this living organism that metabolizes everything that comes towards it. And that's like, I mean, that kind of cultural plasticity is so central to the idea of Hinduism. So can you kind of walk us through how we get to that point?
It's partly because Hinduism is not a religion of the book. Because if you have a book, a prophet, and that structure of religion, then there's a degree of core beliefs, core dogmas, etc., around which the entire infrastructure of the religion is formed. But in a system like Hinduism, which is more of a composite, it's more of a conglomerate, there's a vague kind of Brahminical unity. There is a sort of Sanskritic thread running through a lot of this. But there's also a lot of diversity because different cults and groups and religious traditions of a local type were drawn into this mainstream over a period of time. So even gods that we are now familiar with as, say, Vishnu's 10 avatars, many of those gods were originally local deities who at some point were brought into the mainstream or the dominant narrative or the Sanskritic narrative by making that deity an avatar. Similarly, you'd have gods getting married, by which, you'd make sure that, okay, now this local goddess is married to this form of Shiva, she's a form of Parvati. So you make that connection. In Tamil Nadu, you have cases where Vishnu is conceptualized as Parvati's brother, I think, in certain shrines. So that way he's also made part of the same fabric. So there's a way in which people are brought together from all kinds of diverse traditions, which is why inherently there is a degree of plasticity. Because when you're bringing in different types of traditions, not all of which you even understand or recognize or are entirely comfortable with, you have to be willing to make certain compromises. There's a certain give and take that takes place. And it's not purely a Brahmin-dominated process. So just as the Brahmin is involved in this, in synthesizing all of this, the Brahmin also has to make compromises. Since we are in Kerala, if you read the whole Keralolpatti story of how Parshuraman brings the Nambudris to Kerala, the story goes that he first brings them to Kerala, attempts to settle them here, and the Nambudris run back. They can't live here because of the wild Nagas, which is probably a reference to local tribes and local people. Then there's a second attempt by Parshurama, and he brings these people. And you find that the initial Gramam, or the village in North Kerala, where that first settlement of Brahmins was formed, they had to adopt some local customs, including the matrilineal system. So matrilineal in Kerala is mostly a non-Brahmin phenomenon among upper caste groups like the Nayars. But this segment of Nambudris, who are called Tirumumba, I think, in Malayalam, in North Malabar, I think, they are matrilineal Nambudris. Subsequent villages or subsequent immigrants did not move to matrilineal, but that initial set had to make certain concessions to local traditions. Even if you look at the Brahmin caste itself, it's highly diverse. Brahmins fight over who's a legitimate Brahmin and who's not. We have cases from Maharashtra where the Peshwa's government is sitting and legislating whether such and such a group is really a Brahmin or whether they are degraded or some other caste. Not all Brahmins are permitted to study the Vedas. We have cases where tribal priests have been upgraded as Brahmins and welcomed into the fold of Brahminhood, but without access to the Vedas. So they're considered lower Brahmins as opposed to higher Brahmins. Same with Nambudris. There's Othola Nambudri, who has Vedic access, Othillata Nambudri, which is the non-Vedic, does not have access to the Vedas Nambudri. So even the Brahmin caste itself becomes highly diverse because it's absorbing not only cultural influences, but actually local tribes, local groups are being drawn into the Brahmin fold. And that's how, if castes are also evolving like that, you can imagine how the broader tissue of that religious system is evolving. So you'll bring in a tribal god, you'll say, okay, we'll accept this god as, say, a form of a higher god or something. Let's stop the animal sacrifice and replace the animal with a cucumber. And that's done. In fact, as late as the 1920s, Sethu Lakshmibai of Travancore does that. She says animal sacrifice is banned. Anywhere you want to sacrifice animals, you sacrifice the cucumber. So that's how animal sacrifice is taken care of. In the Gangetic belt, we have a caste like the Musahars, which I cite in the book. And they have two brother deities. And in relatively recent times, people have said, oh, yeah, your brother deities are basically Rama and Lakshmana, and they're forms of Rama and Lakshmana. So these processes are still underway. The Sanskritizing process is still underway. But that malleability you refer to comes precisely because there is no form or outer shape that was given to this. It was a constantly expanding tapestry, a constantly expanding fabric where almost every century new weaves come into it. And it's amorphous for that reason. And precisely because of that, when it comes in contact with foreign religions, and say foreign religions are shaped like this bottle, this fabric is also able to assume the shape of the bottle, saying, yeah, you've got the bottle, we can also form ourselves as a bottle. If you're coming as a flat object, we can also form ourselves as a flat object. So there's actually a missionary who complains that these natives are very shifting in their perspectives. One says one thing, the next says something else. But the frank truth is, all of these things are true. Even contradiction can be acceptable.
And you're saying you started off by saying that it's because there is no singular book for Hinduism. But then there are so many books. Like we start out with the Vedas and then we go to the Puranas, and you seem to have a lot of admiration for the Puranas themselves. And we keep, the corpus keeps expanding. Then at some point the Gita becomes like the one single handbook. So can you maybe walk us through that trajectory also?
That's precisely because of this taking the form of a rival religion phenomenon, because having come into contact with, say, the West, having come into contact with Western intellectuals who believe that religions must have a book, there must be some sort of core scripture in which your religious ideals appear. There it became useful to be able to point to something like the Gita as that one solo book. Even the Vedas were tough there because the Vedas have an archaic language. They're much older. There's 4 of them to start with. There are different parts in the Vedas, so it's a bit more complicated to understand. But the Gita won Western admiration very early. Already in the 18th century, there were white people in India who were quite impressed with the Gita. So a lot of Hindu intellectuals not only picked up the Gita and promoted it, but romanticized the Gita because they thought it would help them stand up to this Western ideal of what a religion should look like. That itself is interesting because this comes out of the Protestant Reformation in Europe. So a lot of things that happen in India are directly linked to things happening in Europe. Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, etc., essentially claim that yes, there's the Bible and there's the Catholic Church, and their argument is that the Catholic Church has corrupted the Christian religion and it has completely lost touch with what the Bible genuinely says. And it's clouded the Bible and hidden the Bible away from most people by keeping it in Latin, etc. So he says, no, we must go back to the scripture. Forget the church, forget local religious traditions that have formed around the church, go back to scripture. So a lot of the British officials coming into India, a lot of these colonizers coming into India in the British period, they're Protestants. They're bringing that Protestant gaze to India as well, where even they're saying, okay, you have Hinduism, but where are your texts? Because just as we have a text on the basis of which everything comes, you guys need to have a text as well. So it's an interplay of certain pressures to which Hindus respond by making the Gita that emblematic Hindu book. So much so that even now in Hindi films in court, when people take oath, it's on top of the Gita. When Rishi Sunak, I think, became MP in the UK, he also took his oath on top of the Gita, with his palm on top of the Gita. The Gita was always important, but it was earlier, till the 18th century or so, the preserve of intellectuals and Sanskrit scholars, not the lay Hindu. Even today, if the lay Hindu doesn't read the Gita, the chances of everybody having most people having the Gita or something like that in their house is higher. You have cases like the Gita Press in North India, which Akshay Mukul's written about, how they brought out these cheap prints of the Gita that simply became accessible to people so that people could have something in their house in the form of a book, just as they saw Christians keeping the Bible.
So a lot of what we talked about is the clash between Hinduism and Christianity is central to your book and very interesting as well. But there's so much in the book about how, on an intellectual level, there is a lot of fascination on both sides. There's a lot of intellectual debate, for example. The Enlightenment thinkers almost, borrow freely from the precepts of Hinduism in order to further their own arguments. Can we talk about some of these intellectual give and take relationships that happen as a result of this encounter?
Yeah, some of them are actually quite fascinating. In the 18th century, there was the first Protestant missionary in India was a man called Ziegenbalg from Germany. He came and settled in Trankaba on the Tamil coast and set up a mission over there. Although when he first came, Ziegenbalg was convinced that all the local people are savages and barbarians. Within only a few weeks, he realized he had the wrong impression, and he sort of changes his impression and he says, no, if we study Aristotle in Europe and we value Aristotle's works, here they have the Tirukural in Tamil and they have something like that here. If we have ancient texts, they have their own ancient texts of Tamil poetry. And just as philosophers in our part of the world fight over certain philosophical questions, these guys also have local philosophers fighting over the same kind of questions. So he already sees that his assumption that these are barbaric people who need to be saved from their religion and brought to Christianity, there's a bit of a question mark that comes up in his mind. Later, in fact, he writes a book called The Genealogy of the Indian Gods, of the Hindu gods, and sends this to Europe, and his European bosses are very upset. They write to him saying that you were sent to India to spread Christianity there. You were not sent there to bring Hinduism into Europe, so you better focus on what you're doing. But Ziegenbalg engages in this fascinating literary dialogue with Hindu scholars. It includes Brahmins, non-Brahmin Shaiva leaders, etc. And the letters are fascinating to read. We don't have them in the original, we have them only in the German form, but they're now also translated into English. And these debates are really hilarious. He meets, for example, at one time a Brahmin, and he says, you're all following the wrong religion. You must therefore be saved by the Bible and become Christian. And the Brahmin responds by saying, you see, God is all-loving, all-knowing, He's omnipotent. So if we have a mistaken, flawed religion, it is God's desire that we should be in a mistaken, flawed religion, and therefore we don't need to be saved by you. If God intended to save us, He would have sent somebody to save us directly, as opposed to sending a white missionary. So He's not convinced by it. Similarly, they say that when Ziegenbalg says that the Bible is the only way to salvation, he says, no, look, just as God appeared to you in the form of Jesus and you had the Bible in your part of the world, here He appeared to us as Vishnu. Here we have our Puranas, here we have our Vedas, we have our own texts here. Because ultimately, God has not created one path to heaven, God has created multiple paths to heaven. And this is a fundamental problem of comprehension between the Christian missionary and the local Hindu intellectuals here. Because the Hindus, not because they're particularly great, but because Hinduism, as I said, has multiple traditions within it, for Hinduism, admitting and acknowledging that there are multiple paths to God came naturally. Because within Hinduism also, there are multiple systems and forms and schools and sects that you can follow. So they bring that logic to the argument, saying that Europeans have your way, we have your way. We have our way. We are not, and they also say that we are not saying your way is flawed. We are not saying that the Bible is bad. We respect Jesus, we believe in the Bible, but it is for you. For us, we have a different set of things. Meanwhile, for the missionary, the conundrum is that because of the nature of Christianity's evolution, the missionary fundamentally believes that God's voice and words have appeared through the Bible. Jesus Christ was the Messiah. This is the only way to God. There can be no other way to God. De facto, anything that is not Christian is paganism or it is devil worship. In fact, when they come to India, initially a lot of the Europeans go to these Hindu temples and they see Hindu gods and they're seeing monsters. They actually use more words like monsters and devils. Since we're sitting in Calicut, there's one gentleman who came to Calicut and he said, oh, they worship a devil here called Diomo. And I kept thinking, what is this Diomo? And then it eventually turns out it was just that he heard the word Devam here and turned that into Diomo. And then it became this whole thing in Europe that Calicut has a devil called Diomo or Diomus. And in my book, there's a picture of Diomus made as late as the 19th century. People thought there was a Diomus, the devil, somewhere in Calicut that people worshipped. Whereas here we only have a poor Shivalingam in the Tali temple. But anyway, Diomo. And Diomo is depicted with fangs, claws, he's got cock's feet, he's wearing this kind of tiara and all of that. Not a deity you've seen anywhere in India, but that's how they envisioned it, because in their mind, these are monsters. So for them also, when they're talking to local Hindus, it creates a fundamental problem because your core idea of the path to God is challenged when you meet a group of people who say, no, there are other paths to God as well. What is interesting is that a few weeks ago, there was a small controversy because I think the Pope, on a visit to a foreign country, did say that there are multiple paths to God or something along those lines. And a lot of conservatives in the Christian world, hyper-conservatives, took umbrage to that because they said, how can you say something like that? You're the Pope, you're not supposed to believe that. You have travelers like Francois Bernier, not a missionary, he's just a traveler. He's passing through India and he sees some Brahmins doing their morning sandhya in the water. And he says, your religion is all stupid. If you did all this in Europe, you'd freeze to death because Europe is cold. So clearly God hasn't mandated any of these customs. To which the Brahmins reply saying, yeah, we are aware that God hasn't mandated these customs. This business with the water and the baths and the purification is for us in our climate, in our part of the world. You go do whatever you want in your part of the world. And to be clear, just as the European had cliches and stereotypes about Indians, that Indians worship monsters, Indians were extremely carnal in nature, all the Indian women were extremely lustful. For sati, they come up with this strange logic that sati was invented because Indian women were too sexually they had too much sexual energy and they had started poisoning their husbands so they could sleep with their lovers. And the husbands, as a response to this, started saying, if you poison us and we die, you have to burn. So it was a way to prevent husband poisoning, apparently. That's the logic Europeans gave for sati. But to be fair, Hindus also had stereotypes about white people. One rather colorful stereotype was that white people like to eat children fried in butter, which in Tamil Nadu, Ziegenbach was very upset to hear. They were Hindus were very, very offended, as was the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan and lots of people in India, that white people did not wash themselves after they went to the toilet, they just used paper, etc. And the Hindus could not understand how people doing that could come here and give you a long sermon about godliness and religion, etc. So the cliches move in both directions.
But it's not just that they're saying, you have your God, we have our God, your God is not necessarily for us, because they're borrowing freely from each other. Like this kind of assimilation is like, you are on your path, I'm on my path, but I'll take a couple of things from your path that actually work for me, right? Like that kind of assimilation, it feels quite like a healthy thing to me. I'm reminded of this old saying in diversity, equity and belonging circles where they say, diversity is like inviting someone to the dance. Inclusion is like asking them to dance. So I feel like there was some kind of a genuine inclusivity in the way in which they approached each other. And then I possibly around the time that they decided that the Gita is the main handbook, and they started like rigidifying and codifying some of these things, this rigidity creeps into it and it stops being assimilative. And this, like the exact pluralism, which is the richness of its origins, gets almost weaponized as a problem, and they decide to draw circles around it. How does that happen?
It's partly because of power, because all these debates that we were discussing, These happened at a time when European power is limited to a few coastal spots like Goa, Tranquebar, Madras, very, very sort of, small pockets. So most people in India are not threatened by the white man. Most people are not threatened by the missionary. So these debates are happening more on equal terms at this time. What happens over a period of time is that the white man's power grows in the country. There's also another difference, which is that the Catholic missionaries who came to India, although in the initial stage in Goa they were extremely violent, and the Portuguese state really did try to sort of suppress Hinduism, etc. Gods had to go into hiding, gods had to go into exile, people had to leave. There are whole communities who had to flee Goa because of oppression and violence there. But even so, a lot of the Catholic missionaries did ultimately sort of adopt local traditions and cultures. So somebody like Roberto de Nobili, who I've written about in an earlier book as well, he goes to Madurai in the 17th century, and his policy is very simple. He says, look, I'm here to give them my religion. I'm not here to meddle with their culture. Their culture is their own. I have my culture, they have their culture. And in order to make myself approachable to the Hindus, I will also become a Hindu in culture while staying a Christian in religion. So what Roberto de Nobili does is, he's an Italian, but this Italian man who comes from the nobility in Europe, he starts wearing what we call kavi, or the saffron robes of a sannyasi. At a certain time, he acquires a punul, like a Brahmin. He starts eating only vegetarian food cooked by Brahmins, and not just in Madurai, even when he goes to Goa to meet his superiors, they're all sitting at the dining table having meat, and he says, no, I can't eat with you Parangis. I'm going to sit separately and eat my Brahmin cooked vegetarian meal. Because he internalizes the way Hindus look up to spiritual figures, that spiritual figures have to act in a certain way. And when he converts people also, you're allowed to retain caste. So if a Brahmin converts, he says, okay, now you're a Christian, so take off your sacred thread, I'll give you a new sacred thread with a cross on it. So the idea of the sacred thread is still okay, the kudumi can be kept, the sacred thread can be kept, except the cross is attached to it, and you become a Christian Brahmin, as it were. And as late as the 19th century, we have official records where communities are referred to as Hindu Christians or Christian Hindus, because it's not that easy to sort of make that bifurcation. There's a negative to this also, in that the Catholic Church in Tamil Nadu, for example, internalizes caste. So Dalit converts are not allowed inside the church, they have to stand near the door. As recently as about 10-12 years ago, we had an article in the Times of India which spoke about how Dalit Christians still face discrimination. They're not allowed to participate in certain rituals, their bodies are not buried in the same cemetery where the upper caste Catholics are buried, etc. Goa also has, despite all of that European presence, Goa has a degree of casteism in its Catholic traditions as well. But the Protestant missionary is different. The Protestant missionary is coming at a time when the British state has become powerful. British power is spreading around all of India. And therefore, the Protestant missionary looks far more threatening than a Roberto de Nobili. Nobili was treated just like a sannyasi. Like, he would go to Hindu courts and Rajas would wash his feet, give him, deer skin to sit on, as if they would do it as they would do it for any other Hindu sannyasi. Because in their eyes, this was just a holy man. Yes, he believed in Christianity, but he was a holy man defined in a Hindu idiom. You have a case in Shivaganga or someplace in Tamil Nadu where a Raja gives a grant to a church, and he says the revenue of this village is assigned to this church for eternity. Anybody who disturbs this grant, they are committing a crime equal to the crime of killing many Brahmins and killing the sacred cow. And what's interesting is the sanctity of the sacred cow, which is a very Hindu concept, is used here to protect a Christian church and to protect a Christian institution. Because between Catholics and Hindus of that 17th century period, there was a certain marriage of culture that took place, and the two communities were able to weave themselves into each other and get along with each other, which was not the case with the Protestant. That's why that rigidity you see in Hinduism from the 19th century partly comes out of a defense mechanism, because you feel that you are now you're not under siege, you're now threatened by the white man and the white man's religion. It's no longer an equal culture of encounters. It's a lopsided culture of encounters where power is in the hands of one set of people with one religious idea and the desire to convert, and the ones who do not have power are the ones who are Hindus and now feel disempowered.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that then brings us to the guns part of the conversation, because power becomes part of the equation, which also, I mean, I guess the thing that continues to fascinate me about this is Hinduism had no definition until it had to define itself for somebody else. Like this kind of othering process, like, you know, it existed because there was the other in the room, and therefore it had to define itself by not being that, right? Like, is that what led to this rigidity, do you think? Like, because of the tension between what it was and what it was not?
But you know, all religions, I think, need another religion or another set of ideas against which they frame their own identity. Because if you look at the evolution of Christianity and Judaism as two separate, like an ism, as two separate religious groups, it comes by playing one off the other. Oh, you believe in such and such things, I don't, and therefore I'm a Jew, and therefore you're a Christian. So there is a playing off even in the evolution of Christianity and Judaism. Similarly with Islam coming into India. There was an academic argument for many years that the idea of Hinduism was invented in the 19th century. But you see that actually that's not true. From the medieval period, you have texts and sources. You have, firstly, the people in power, the sultans, the Mughal court. They make a clear bifurcation between the Hindus on the one side and the Muslims on the other side. So they clearly see two different master groups in India. Something as small as Mughal miniature paintings, you'll see that the Hindus in the court, they tie their jama in one direction, the Muslims tie their jama in another direction. I recently discovered that in Kerala, but not so much in Tamil Nadu, the way the mund is tied, the mund border on what this side suggests Hindu, this side suggests Muslim. So there's a subtle way in which people were able to make a bifurcation. You have texts like all the way from the 15th, 16th century down to down to the 18th century, where there is a clear sense that there is a Hindu and there is a Turuska. Turuska comes from Turk, equal to Muslim. So in Eknath's Hindu-Turk Samvad, which is I think from the 17th or 16th century, I forget, he basically has a Hindu and a Muslim talking to each other. At first, they are making fun of each other's religions. So the Muslim says, oh, you have your Vedas mean nothing. You go to idols and worship these blocks of stone. You bow down in front of sadhus. Your Puranic stories are all rubbish. So he makes fun of Hinduism that way. The Hindu reciprocates. He says that, oh, you don't actually believe in any of your Quranic precepts. Your actions are completely against your Quranic religion. Your goat sacrifice is a strange custom, etc. So they're lampooning each other. So they're also implicit is the fact that they see a difference between each other. At the end of the story, they come together, they hug each other, and they say, oh, ultimately, these are two different paths to the same God. But before reaching that point of friendship, the rest of the piece is about debate and disagreement and lampooning between two different groups. What happens, therefore, is that in the 19th century, faced with an intellectually dominant British idea of what religion is. Religion must have a book, therefore we must have a book, the Gita. Religion must have a clear outline, therefore we must also form a clear outline. Religion in the West and the dominating West that we are now dealing with romanticizes monotheism. Therefore, within our Hindu traditions, we must also pick up on those elements that are monotheistic in nature, because that is what the world values. So you see that Hindus of that time, because they feel they are under pressure from the white man, they reconceptualize Hinduism to fit a new mold. You know, you know, to use an analogy from a missionary, which I sort of bend a little bit, he says that, oh, Hinduism is nothing but, you know, Christian wine in Hindu bottles. Whereas actually what you see is it's Hindu wine in a Christian bottle. Like a Christian conceptualization of religion is borrowed, appropriated, made our own, and then given that shape in a Hindu form.
I mean, I guess I'm kind of circling around the same question in 100 different ways, because, Manu, I'm a little bit worried, if I'm being honest. I feel like a religion that started off as incredibly inclusive and free-flowing has become exclusionary, and it's become, Hindu identity has become Hindu nationalism. And that gives me a lot of reason to worry about the future of this country, also the future of Hinduism. Why did that happen?
Okay, firstly, I disagree. I don't think we should equate the Hindu identity with Hindu nationalism. Hindu nationalism is a different commodity. It comes with a certain political goal. And I think the assumption we make that Hindu identity is now equal to Hindu nationalism ends up empowering Hindu nationalism and inflates its importance. The frank truth is, even now, and it's not just me stating this as a matter of opinion. I mentioned this elsewhere also. There was a few years ago something called the Pew Research something. And they did this research study in India, and they basically said that even now, most of Hindu society believes in the idea of tolerance. It is tolerance with certain conditions, which is that if you're a Muslim or a Christian, we will we will be happy for you to coexist with us, but there should be no overlap. Like there should be no coming here and we will not come in your path. Let all paths exist, but they have to mutually coexist. One should not dominate the other. So there is that understanding, but there is still that feeling of tolerance that is there. At the same time, on the ground, I think Hinduism still remains extremely diverse. Even now, when we go to Sabrimala, we first go to Vavar's mosque and then go to Sabrimala. That's how most pilgrims who come in from the other parts of South India, it's not just a Kerala phenomenon. Tamilians, Andhrites, all of them who flood into Kerala during the Sabrimala season follow that path, even today. They may be voting for a Hindu nationalist party in an election, but in their practice, that ritual, that tradition still matters to them. So I would push back against the claim that Hindu nationalism has somehow become so dominant that it has eclipsed the Hindu identity. Another political way of putting it is perhaps this whole Babri Masjid phenomenon. You know, after the temple was consecrated there, it's interesting that in the elections that seat was lost by the party that consecrated the temple. It's, you know, because clearly there's something to read into that. There is something that consecration was meant to be a stamp of a certain kind of reading of homogenized, very rigid Hinduism. And yet there was a public kind of response to that, which was not a favorable response. Yeah. So there's still hope that, you know, we should not conflate the two. But as to why this happens, of course, through the 19th century, you have Hindu thinkers who are, you know, anxious to define Hinduism. They're anxious to give it a form. Raja Ram Mohan Roy is one of the figures I cover in this book. Ram Mohan Roy begins from a point of great doubt in general. As a young man, he writes a Persian text. And in this Persian text, he's basically rejecting the idea of religion itself. He says religion is entirely man-made. Whether it's Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, it's all man-made traditions. God has not created a religion. All religions are creations of man. That's Raja Ram Mohan Roy's initial stance. But as he matures, he also realizes that religion is linked to identity. So he may not believe in religion, but to save his identity as a brown man in a colonized country, he feels that the Hindu religion needs to be given a certain shape. Now, he's also a product of this new mentality, which is a Protestant way of thinking. So he says, okay, we must be monotheistic. So he says, forget the temples, forget the idols, go back to the Upanishads, because the Upanishads talk about an abstract monotheistic God. This God will allow us to stand up to the pressure of the Christian missionary. Because if the Christian missionary says monotheism is supreme, we can also say our Upanishads have monotheism. Similarly, the idea of the book, all of that. So he creates an intellectual defense and scaffolding for Hinduism. It is true largely on Western terms, but it is intended to defend the Hindu identity from the foreigner. That's essentially what Ram Mohan Roy is doing. Somebody like Dayananda Saraswati has a very different trajectory. Dayananda Saraswati is not anglicized. Dayananda Saraswati, as a young man sitting in a temple during Shivaratri, sees a mouse around Shiva's image. And he says, if this is God, how can a mouse be floating around it with such ease? So clearly the idol is not God. And for some 20-25 years, Dayananda Saraswati runs away from home. Like all Indian parents, his parents try to prevent this by getting him married. He avoids the marriage and runs away anyway. Becomes a wandering sannyasi. Goes through all kinds of experiments. He takes bhang at one point, hoping that that will elevate him to a different plane and he'll be able to understand religion better. He meets all kinds of sannyasis. He's very disappointed by the sannyasis he meets. End of the day, he finds a guru and he decides, okay, I'm going to revive a Vedic idea of Hinduism. And he also, without any exposure to the Christian missionary, says no idol worship, none of that. What's interesting is that he founds an organization called the Arya Samaj. And the Arya Samaj is where we first see a mass mobilization of Hindus as Hindus. One of the first things they do in the 19th century is mobilizing people around the cow and the idea of cow protection, which is still very salient in India today. And what they do is they see that Hindus are a very splintered, diverse society, right? There are different castes, different sects. But most Hindu communities would venerate the cow. So in order to unite them on the ground, cow protection became a means to mobilize them as one under one label as Hindu. So that became one motive of his. Similarly, reconversion. Just as at one point a Christian missionary could convert whole villages of people, etc., the Arya Samaj has this thing where they have reconversion rituals, where they say, oh, this year so many thousand people reconverted to Hinduism. And this is happening from the late 19th century, 20th century. So the Arya Samaj takes essentially a missionary formula, but uses it to re-empower Hinduism against the missionary and indeed against Islam as well. And Islam becomes a new other. In the Hindu conceptualization at this time. And finally, we have internal critics like Pillai, but also people like Tilak and Savarkar who are trying to define the word Hindutva itself.
I want to now move out of the realm of this, the contents of the book and kind of find a way to draw the longer arc of your career, Manu, because I think this is your most ambitious book yet. And
Are you saying that because you're my publisher?
I am saying that because I'm your publisher. Thank you for asking. But also, genuinely, I feel like you have moved out of event-based history writing into theme-based history writing, if that makes sense. And I wonder how that arc makes sense for you in your head as a historian.
You know, I think I like to experiment a little bit. So, Endo?
Sorry guys, we're negotiating for time.
നോക്കാം പക്ഷേ ഞാൻ അങ്ങനെ ഇറങ്ങിപ്പോത്തില്ല people will wait. No, 5 minutes makes no difference. Where was I? Oh no, my career, yes. So the thing is, initially my very first book was 700 pages, rooted around the story of one figure and her arc from the late 19th century to the 1980s. So it was one individual story through which I wove some other things. So much more granular in detail. But that was my first book, 700 pages. So almost as a challenge to myself, I did Rebel Sultans, my book on the Deccan, just to see if I was able to sort of condense 5 centuries into one slender text of 300 pages. And I was able to do that. People liked that book as well. Then I did a book of essays. Then I did False Allies. But yes, earlier my focus was very much on granular studies. I was very interested in specific subjects, specific moments, specific dynamics. But again, as you get older, I've been publishing now for 10 years. You know, I'm 35 now. My first book came out, almost 35. My first book came out when I was 25. And what's interesting is that you also mature.
Sorry, ridiculous. Like to have such a successful book at the age of 25, frankly ridiculous, Manu.
Thank you. Don't jinx it. But you know, the point is you also mature and your interests also evolve over a period of time. And because we live in the world in which we live, and I've noticed that a lot of the Hindutva conversation, the book is not about Hindutva, right? But I noticed that a lot of the conversations around the Hindu identity, I have this Hindu-Muslim prism. And I thought there was a gap where we were not looking at the role of colonialism and the presence of evangelical Christianity. Not Christianity as a religion, but the missionary as an evangelical force during the colonial time and how that impacted modern Hinduism. So then I decided I need to zoom out a little bit. I can't go into these granular details. I need to look at a big picture. So this is really a big picture kind of book, trying to understand all of India. So the narrative of the book begins in South India. It begins in Goa. It moves to Kerala. It moves to Tamil Nadu. Then it moves to Bengal. Then it moves to North India. Finally ends in Maharashtra. So it's really a journey through the Indian subcontinent that way, leaving out, of course, some parts like Rajputana or the Northeast, because the Northeast, for example, has a slightly different history. So it doesn't fit neatly into this narrative. But yes, it's a very zoomed out study.
And as always, my last question to you before turning it over to the audience, do you identify as a Hindu?
My answer is the same that I gave you the first time you asked this on the spot in Bangalore. And I was like, But at that time I had to think on my feet. Now I know the answer because it gave me clarity in my own position, which is, so I go to Shiva temples. I'm fond of the idea of Shiva. Because in many ways, I think Shiva is one of those out-of-the-box gods. It's very difficult to sort of give a neat, very sattvic form to Shiva. I find him very interesting as a phenomenon, as a form of conceptualizing divinity. Even the way Shiva is represented in a very simple form, I find that personally very appealing as well. But the reason I go to temples is not necessarily because I'm convinced that in that Shiva temple there is a portal to God. To me, partly because I'm so fascinated by history, stepping into a historical site or stepping into a place that has been held sacred for so many generations, for so many centuries, it for a brief flicker, it gives you a sense of timelessness. For a brief second, it connects you to something that was here long before you. For example, in my ancestral place, there's a Shiva temple my family are connected to in a place called Nedurankoda. And in Nedurankoda, this temple eventually, fell out of use. It had to be renovated in some years ago, etc. But it's supposed to be 1,000 years old. And I keep thinking that so much has changed. 1,000 years ago, much of Kerala was still in a tribal state. Over a period of time, monarchies emerged. Local monarchies were destroyed by the Maharaja of Travancore. It became one broader state. Colonialism came in a certain form. That state vanished. We became part of a democratic republic. But through all of these shifting sands of time, that Shivalingam has been sitting there as a constant. that connection to history gives me some joy, some sense of connection, or some sense of something deep within when I go to an old temple. That's why new temples don't appeal to me. I'm not a new temple person. I'm always a person who likes holy sites that are ancient or old in nature. And it isn't purely a Hindu phenomenon. Even, we have sites in Kerala, say, mosques that are really old, 6th, 7th century old. I mean, Kozhikode has one called the Mishkal Mosque. Even when you go there, you feel a similar feeling that this structure has been, the place around the Mishkal Mosque has changed so much. There are modern buildings, etc. But the mosque itself stands there as representative of something that's, part of the longer arc of history itself. So, yeah, I identify as a Hindu in the sense that going to temples gives me a connection. That's all.
Thank you. Now, I know this audience has a lot of questions for him, so let's have a mic going around to people. Yeah.
Hi, Manu. It's very pleasure to listen you always. So I would like to ask about the recent fiasco on Twitter and on newspaper regarding the William Dalrymple's comment on that academic historians are responsible for not letting mass the engaging and very accessibility to the history, and you yourself as a non-academic historian, even though you are a doctoral student. So I want to know your thoughts on the non-academic historians.
I think, William, in that interview space, by the way, that happened at an Indian Express event. The video is still not out. So what often happens is that when an interview is paraphrased to fit one page in a newspaper, sometimes the newspaper edits things out. So I still don't know what exactly he said. I've got a version of what he said from the Indian Express, and that's what the whole controversy is about. I think he flattened it a little bit when he said that, academics are, partly responsible for the rise of WhatsApp history. I don't think WhatsApp history comes out of academic neglect. WhatsApp history is a deliberately engineered phenomenon that's come out in recent years. Even if academics were around, even now, some of us are addressing the public, right? But there's still WhatsApp history because it's a deliberately created phenomenon. It's not something that's created out of a vacuum. Some people are actively investing in WhatsApp history. There are people actively creating those fake forwards because they have certain goals. But yes, I agree with him to the extent that there is an important duty for the historian today, academic as well as non-academic, to address larger audiences. We cannot keep complaining that good history is not reaching people if we don't make the effort to reach out to people and communicate it to people. This is the age of the internet. It is the age of the social media and all of that. You don't even need to go out into an audience to reach people. You can start a YouTube channel. There are academics who are doing it. There's an academic who does this whole makeup thing and then discusses history while she's doing makeup. She's also a PhD from JNU. But she's got people's attention and she's able to push back against a lot of things. I haven't seen too many videos, but I noticed that there is an academic doing something like that. I'm not saying everybody has to do makeup videos and create YouTube channels, but there are different ways in which you can engage the public, and I think that's important.
Hi, sir. So even before this book was published, when I saw your interview, what you always said that you are going to be get a lot of criticism, and in terms of Twitter or Instagram, you told that you will be cancelled because of that. How far that is going?
So I really thought with this book, I would be cancelled by both left and right, because different parts of the book are capable of offending ideologies on either side. Strangely, and it's early days, it's just less than 3 months at the moment for the book. So far, nobody's cancelled me. What's happened, ironically, is people on both sides seem to be liking the book. So that's doing wonderfully for sales. Mansi and her team are very happy because apparently people across the ideological divide are reading the book.
The book actually went into its 4th print today.
Yes, yeah, that was nice. But I think we also had 2 reviews, one in the Financial Times and one in the Asian Review of Books, which made the same point, that this is a book that will speak to both sides in a constructive way. Because again, the point is that I'm not trying to, throw the cat among the pigeons. The idea is I want people to think. And I want people not just on one side to think, but on the other side to also think. I want everybody to be able to challenge notions that they've inherited or internalized and rethink some of these subjects. Sometimes it makes us uncomfortable. Sometimes even in the process of research, you reach conclusions that may not sit well with your personal opinion or your personal ideology. But you still have to stand by that conclusion because it's come out of that research process. And even if it's unpopular, you have to be true to what you've discovered. And I want people also to be able to understand that. And therefore, yeah, so far no cancellation. It's been, touch wood, a good response.
Uh, Hi. So we had many polytheistic religions like the Olympians, the Norse gods, etc. All of them had the similarities with Hinduism too. So all of them failed to sustain when these other religions came, but Hinduism survived. What made Hinduism unique from those other religions?
So I think that's actually a question lots of people have asked historically, that in Europe also there was pagan cultures. In Europe also people worshipped idols. They had animal sacrifices. They had what we call kava. They had forms of that worshipping trees. So Europe also at one time was pagan. You know, in parts of Scandinavia, etc., in northern Europe, it was as late as the 14th century, 13th century that all the people were finally fully converted. And to be fair, even now in a lot of Christian practices in Europe, there are cultural elements that are inherited from that pagan past. So it's true that, you know, those religions were largely wiped out. And that's why I understand why a lot of Hindus take offense when you refer to the epics or the Puranas as mythology. Because the term mythology is used for these cultures which are no longer living cultures. You have their texts and their beliefs, but nobody believes in those things anymore. You can only analyze them academically, read them out of interest. You don't believe in those religions anymore. Whereas their argument is that Hindu texts cannot be called mythology because they are still alive and this religious tradition is still alive. I think part of it is precisely because that Brahmanical impulse to unite Hinduism at one level played a certain role. The other was the capacity to say that, oh, you've brought us monotheism, we already have monotheism. This shape-shifting ability that Hinduism had was something perhaps these pagan cultures elsewhere did not necessarily have. Also here, by the time the European came, in fact, even at the time Islam came initially, you have all right-wingers now on Twitter have all these fanciful numbers that so many millions of people were converted, etc. If you look at the figures of Muslims in India today, it doesn't add up. If that many millions were converted then, we'd see a lot more Muslims in the country. But even, I think, Islamic scholars, if you read some of the Islamic commentators from earlier times, they also have this puzzle as to how this religious system is continuing in this form. But I think it's because of that malleability, because of that shape-shifting ability. And in the modern period, it's again shape-shifted into what we call Hinduism. Hinduism is an 18th century term. But we've internalized it, we've appropriated it, because we've also accepted a new form of Hinduism that maybe our ancestors 3 centuries ago would not have recognized fully.
Manu, good evening. First of all, I'd like to say I'm a big fan of your work. Thank you for doing all the books that you've done, and also for the references that you put at the end of the books, so many of them.
You're my favorite type of reader who likes the notes.
So, unfortunately, I had decided on one question, but then I kind of developed another one. It would be nice if you could answer either of them. First is, how does your personal ideology work into your interpretation of the documents that you research for your work? And also second, it seems that through all your books, you end at the highlight of some of major Indian histories. As in for Rebel Sultans, you end at, I think, Shivaji. And in God's Guns and Missionaries, you think end at Savarkar. So are you planning on a big Avengers level book talking about the entirety of popular Indian history?
Good Lord, no, that would be too much to chew on. But on the earlier point, the question on personal ideology, I think that's an interesting question. I think, as I always say, a degree of subjectivity exists in all historians. You cannot completely extricate yourself from your overall position in life. Your caste position, your gender, what you've studied, the language in which you've studied, all of this conditions how you study certain subjects. So personal choices perhaps come in the subjects I choose to study. I'm interested in certain themes, I'm interested in certain topics because of personal exposure and personal life. For example, you'll find in a lot of my books, this is my most masculine book. There are barely any women in this book. But all my earlier books have a strong female presence. I'm pretty sure some of it comes out of personal exposure to strong women in my formative years. Somehow I noticed that this is what I'm seeing in life, lots of strong women and important women with agency. And yet in the historical record, I'm not seeing women with agency. So how do I square this? So that led me to sort of putting women at the center of a lot of these narratives. So personal ideology might come in choosing a lot of my topics, but then when you hit the record, you are trained not to bring your personal ideas into it. In fact, this book originated originally as my master's dissertation in 2011 when I was 21 years old, and I wrote a dissertation, I got a distinction for it, etc. But if you read that dissertation now, which was on the same theme of modern Hinduism, and you read this new book, you'll see that my conclusions have shifted. Because what I believed as a 21-year-old was ideas I'd inherited from people. But now at 34, I'm able to come to conclusions myself and even push back against some of my own earlier conclusions because I'm not allowing my personal ideas to sort of impose on the conclusions I reach.
I think maybe we have time for one more question.
Who has the mic?
Okay, wait.
ഒരെണ്ണം കൂടെ one. Oh, Meera Hathiyo. Oh. Okay. All right. No more questions. Mainly not because the volunteers are asking, but because I like the next two speakers, and therefore I will vacate the stage so they can start. Thank you again for being a wonderful audience. Mansi, thank you for being a wonderful moderator.
Thank you all.